So, one of the things that I have been thinking about as of late with all of this, conversation about the science-based stuff and
Mm.
like the pushback to the science-based stuff, some of which is actually scientific, some of which is just like bro attacks. First of all, I think it's all fun and entertaining. And I never really understand when people say things like, talking about this is pointless, like as if anyone is being forced, to listen to any of this stuff. Like, I have a gun to your head and like play this YouTube video or else, right? Um, but one of the things that I think hasn't been discussed as much, because both of us had made videos about, just maybe the general problems with this sort of science-based or pseudoscience-based movement, but not a lot of us, I think, have talked about, what are the sort of tools that we can use within ourselves or develop within ourselves to be able to sift through information on our own, right? Because something that I think you do a really, really, really good job of on your channel um, is you not only do you make things super digestible and you speak in simple language in a way that is, I can tell like, oh, this dude has taught people in the past, but you stick to topics that really, really matter on an obvious level, right? It's like simple sort of principle-based concepts that most people don't focus enough on, right? And I think the industry needs more of that. And I think that your channel has gained traction for obvious reasons related to that. Um, but one of the things that I find sort of like puzzling just about the whole thing is that, you know, people have options, right? They don't have to sort of pigeonhole themselves on one channel or another. They can learn about the more in-depth biomechanics simultaneous to the general principles. This is kind of tangential, but I promise I'll circle back here. Um, and I just think that overall, like people have options, but one of the things that people seem to be very confused about is like what to watch, right? So they have the FazLifts, but then they also have like, and I'll take responsibility for everything I say here. They have the Micah Zertels, which are like very, sort of over the top, like I'm creating this very big brand and I'm producing videos every day about very minor things that are more entertaining than useful. I don't think anything is wrong inherently with any of that, but yet people get sucked into 100 different directions, right? They get sucked into your direction, which I think is pretty much, from what I've seen, purely positive. They get sucked into my direction, which, depending on what, point in time you look at my content, I think is really positive or really negative. I think I would hope it's at its peak positive now. But all of this is just to say and to really ask you is like, how do we begin to sort of create something valuable, not in the sense of the specific information, but more in like the meta cognition of like, how do we talk about topics in the context of this conversation now, where we're teaching people not just information, how many sets, how many reps, principles of volume, etc. But how do we talk about information in a way that it makes it easy for people to identify what kind of information is useful, right? How do we, in essence, make things digestible in a way that is not just teaching someone sort of, the black and white information, but more the principle of learning altogether, right? I know it's kind of, I'm not phrasing that super, super well, but
No, no.
hopefully you kind of get what I mean there.
No, no, I totally understand. Um, Brought to mind, I've had a couple of questions on my in my comments, very much about this actually. So I think it's a very insightful question. I had a question from a beginner just recently saying, "Look, I'm a complete beginner. You make a strong case. I also listen to Mike Israetel and whoever else, and I'm just mentioning that because you did, and a few others. But how do I know who is legitimate and who isn't at this stage of the game? How do I know?" And I think even if you're a beginner or if you're intermediate or very advanced, I think it's a very valid question. So my answer to him relates to what you mentioned there about overriding principles. For me, one of the strongest overriding principles is that of progressive overload. So I said to him, if it allows you to consistently add weight to the bar over time, it's a good thing. And I'll give you an example where one of my clients has asked me a question about something which has ruined his progressive overload track. So he said he used to bench something like 100 kilos for a set of 10, but he tried a new technique because he saw something on TikTok or whatever it was. And this new technique now has him benching 185 or like 80 kilos. And that's reduced the weight on the bar. And it's a very minor technique difference, but it feels a lot more awkward for him. It feels very alien. So as a result, he's getting less stimulation on the chest because it's significantly less weight. And also he's finding progression quite difficult because it feels very awkward for him. So in that sense, I'm going to suggest to him, maybe you should go back to what you were doing before because you're missing gains there. Um, like the old days, people would look at say continuous tension on the muscle and that as a form of getting a better burn and a pump and all that kind of stuff. But we know that having a more reasonable pause lockout is probably going to allow you to dissipate some of those fatigue elements which occur as you go through a set of 8 to 12 on an exercise, which will probably lead to better performance. So perhaps the continuous tension and burn is not the greatest idea because it will ultimately reduce progressive overload. So I think for me, the first principle, which is what I talk about a lot, is this idea of progressive overload. And the sentence that I use quite a lot on my channel is progressive overload with standardized form, because I'm not a stickler on any one particular type of form. Progressive overload with standardized form for a reasonable bodybuilding rep range. That's become kind of my tagline. And I think as long as you adhere to that, you can't really go far wrong. So whatever particular biomechanics you like using, as long as you're targeting an area and you're consistent with them, I think that's probably the best overriding principle. My concern is when people look at a range of different voices, like myself, like Mike Israel or whoever else, and they flip between different philosophies, and they flip every few months, every few years. That can really demolish and derail somebody's progress. Something that Lyle McDonald said a while back in a podcast was powerlifters often grow better than bodybuilders. That's simply because they have a singular focus. To use a FazLifts terminology, my markers of progression were the squat, bench, and deadlift for 14 years. So 14 years, I was getting better at just those three lifts, which is why I continuously got better and better. So yeah, to answer your question, I think I think your point on overriding principles is a really good one, and that's probably one of my strongest ones.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you is kind of like if the information that you as the listener, as the consumer is consuming connects ultimately back to this thread of I can essentially do more over time in these same ways with these same techniques, with these same tempos, etc. Thumbs up, right? And like keep riding the wave and ride the wave for as long as you possibly can. And I think, broadly speaking, I agree with that. That one of the things too that I was thinking of is, when it comes to like information and information spaces, just given the raw magnitude of like a volume now that is in information spaces, it is totally understandable to me that people are running into this problem just perpetually, because it's very difficult in this particular domain to tell what is working. Like, what does working even mean? Are normal people going to be taking like circumference measurements? Are they going to be doing DEXA scans? Not to speak to the legitimacy or illegitimacy of any of those things, but just, the average person is probably even has a difficult time telling what works. So I totally agree that the proxy for that is like, hey, this is the most obvious thing, and it would make sense that if we stay this, course over time, that we're going to inevitably see progress. The one thing that I would say as well is, you know, with this sort of surge in information, what I have observed in specifically my audience over time, um, which, over time, meaning the last, like, I guess 5 years, 6 years I've been online now, public posting, is people seem to be less and less and less willing to just try something. Like there's this kind of approval seeking. I'll give a good example where a lot of the time I will make a post. Okay. I make a post every day, roughly speaking. And whenever there is someone from someone else's audience Because people have like, certain creators that they like and trust a lot, which I totally understand. I'm like, I'm the same way. Um, a lot of times what will happen is instead of the person who is skeptical of, say, my stance, instead of them asking a question out of curiosity or just, bluntly espousing disagreement, what they'll do is instead they'll say nothing and they'll just tag the other creator, right? And
Yeah.
oftentimes they'll tag the other creator and they'll put like a question mark or like thoughts or and so it's a microcosm of the whole picture to me, which is people are less and less willing to at least just try to think through something on their own. And at minimum, what I would say is it honestly, and I'm hopefully this doesn't get taken out of context, but it honestly doesn't really matter that much who you listen to in any span of time. If you listen to someone and they're like, hey, bro, do this pull down this way, right? Great, fantastic. Doesn't matter what I say, doesn't matter what Faz says. Just do it for a month, 2 months, maybe just do it for half a year. Just commit to it, see what happens. Um, you'll have like that's the way that you ultimately process information. People think the processing occurs at the level of like, do I understand this? Do I agree with this thing about the lats or whatever it happens to be? But really, it's the translation from that point to how does this actually, work in my understanding. So I think the where my head goes first with this conversation is can you, as the viewer, the listener, develop an ability to just be more tolerant to the idea of like patience and application? Can you apply something and just see how it goes? So before I go any further, did anything sort of come up for you there? Agree,
Yeah,
disagree?
I think I think it's a really good point. I think it's potentially a cultural issue due to maybe the advent of social media and the internet. I think a lot of people these days seem to be very afraid of failure, and so that paralyzes them into trying. And they want to know the definite solution and the definite best way forward before they even attempt thing. I noticed this as I was a school teacher, and towards the tail end of my teaching career, there was a definite shift in student type who just didn't, who would rather not try than try and feel the embarrassment of failure. Whereas that wasn't the case necessarily. Certainly, for me, when I was younger, I did my first powerlifting competition at 18 years old. I had no idea what was going on. I went down to London. My brother drove me, did my first squat, failed that completely. I was so nervous, fell through the floor, and
Nice.
and came back and did the second one. I was okay, but I didn't care because there were no cameras on me. There was no particular pressure. I didn't have a social media where I was going to post on and post about it. I just went and did stuff, you know. I didn't even really have a phone at that point. It was a one of those Nokias, which also acted as a safety device to attack anyone who, So, but yeah. So the point is, I think nowadays I've seen the definite shift towards there being this focus towards knowing the one true answer. And so when they have the situation where, rightfully so, I might say something, you might say something, and we might be at odds with each other, well, that's fine. It's okay to have two opinions in the space because they both probably work within the confines of the overall system that we're teaching. There can be low volume advocates who do very well, high volume advocates who do very well. I'm more moderate. So there are differences, but if you apply something from higher volumes, like for example an RAR approach to a low volume routine, that's probably not going to work very well because if your volume's low, you should be doing higher intensity. And I think people look for that's a very obvious example, but there are other more subtle ones. And I think people look for this one true answer and they pit people against each other. And in their heads, they are just genuinely wanting to know like, what's the route forward. But to go back to something you were saying, which I think is very true, it's a strong point that I've made on my channel before as well. The biggest detriment to your training is not going to be choosing a 90% ineffective routine. It's going to be changing. If you change routine to something which is different, it's that reacclimatization period where you have to get used to the new routine. You're not progressing. My audience will know I refer to something as the golden zone, and that is when you're in that position with an exercise or group of exercises where you are not only training hard, but you are at the point where you're at your maximum ever, and you're maybe adding 1 or 2 reps per session, or if that. That's the gold zone. That's where you grow. And I think the problem with people moving things around and switching so often is they never get to the golden zone. And the long-term consequence of that, just to really go on a bit, is that they never really understand what it feels like. Because I'm sure you've been there before. you know, because I saw a reel of yours and I thought, hey, this guy's pretty jacked. You were doing something about hip hinge. That guy's got big legs. So I'm sure you've been there before, but you've been in that position in a training cycle where you were maybe adding 1 or 2 reps per session, and it's brutal. I don't think people are accustomed to that because they switch things around so often.
Yeah. I mean, dude, adding one rep every couple of weeks to something that you've been progressing for like a year is like the reward is disproportionate to the way that it looks. You're like, oh my God, another,
Yeah.
freaking rep on this thing. Yeah, just to sort of tie the knot on this part of the conversation, because I do want to myself express some concrete takeaways for people listening in terms of like what to look for now in terms like in relation to specific language. And this is something that I had talked about a lot, but I think is a topic that is cannot be talked about enough given the current context of the industry, is the more confident and the more absolute the language, on a very general level, I would say the less likely it is that I am willing to be super open to listening to someone. Now, this can get a little bit hairy when we're talking about something like, let's say, like physics. Because in physics, at least at the level that societally we currently understand physics, um, there are answers that are in effect right or wrong, right? Like it is wrong to say that my biceps, straighten my elbow concentrically. That is a wrong, incorrect statement to make. And that's a simple example, but there are many, many examples which are more difficult to C, because they involve, let's say, an understanding of physics that is a little bit deeper than just do my biceps bend my elbow or do they straighten my elbow? So, but all things on some level occur there. So with the physics, the most objective side of things, I think that's where I err on the side of speaking more confidently. But simultaneous to that, a lot of times you can speak confidently about the physics, but also express uncertainty about the application of that physics. So I could say something, for instance, like, the short head of the biceps, it can adduct the arm. Well, the long head of the biceps can actually abduct the arm. So I could speculate, oh, if I do a curl, let's say with a cable that's pulling me into, extension and abduction, that may actually be an exercise that could recruit more of the short head, whereas this other thing could recruit more of the long head. I can describe the physics, but then the conclusion of that could be speculative, right? So I think that even within the domain of physics in application, we can express that as uncertainty. So that like the willingness to express uncertainty, I think, is a really big thing for me. And right up there at the top of the list for me would also just be how much can the person you are listening to provide context around a claim? So if they make a claim, does it stay at the sort of like floaty generalization, vague level, or does it funnel down into something that is more specific, more descriptive? And are they able to actually apply principles as you're discussing, especially across scenarios? Or is there an application that is always the same? Is it the same for person A, B, and C, or are things slightly different across scenarios? So context and specificity, and then also certainty. Those are my three sort of big ones. I don't know if you have anything to add to that list or anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, I've been told I do this fairly well in terms of providing context and nuance. And I think it's because I've been taught as a school teacher that if you're presenting an idea to a class, you almost, rather than trying to find a way to teach them, you almost have to predict where they're going to go wrong before you teach the class. So,
Mm.
like, right, I'm going to say this. Well, they're going to ask about this. Well, now I have to provide context. And now they're going to ask about this. Well, I have to provide nuance. So I just do that kind of automatically. It's not something I think about when I'm doing it, but it seems to resonate with people when I speak. Because in my mind, when I'm thinking about a video and an idea that I want to talk about, I will try to preempt where people will go wrong without understanding. And that normally translates into some nuance, which it has to really, because like we were talking about a second ago, whatever I say, it's within the context of a system that I'm talking about, which may be different to a system that somebody else is talking about, but they both may be valid. So I think it does go back to what we were saying. As long as it is fitting some overriding principles which work across all systems, then that's okay. I think the unfortunate thing is potentially that some of those principles in lifting weights are actually quite simple. And people, I have some very intelligent clients, clients who are in engineering, in IT and all that kind of stuff. And I think they're drawn naturally to more complicated answers because that's the field they come from.
Mm,
Um, and I think the solutions in bodybuilding tend to be a lot simpler than we would
mm,
like. The complication in bodybuilding really is in the compliance. That's the difficulty, not necessarily in how to build muscle. So oftentimes I've been quite critical of things like length and partials and stretch media hypertrophy, and I've had some pushback on that, which is fine. But my point is the reason I don't like those things is because they distract people and they get people to hop on a new routine or a new technique to reset their weights. And that's 3 months of lost progress, or at least a month of lost progress until the next thing they find. So yeah, my approach may be classified as boring, but it is very effective. So, and predominantly I'm a coach, I'm not a YouTuber, so it
mhm.
works for me.
So, okay, so that's super interesting. So I can totally resonate with the person who is attached to things that are more kind of like ethereal and abstract because I'm also one of those people and I tend to lean in that direction. So I have to constantly self-correct. One of the questions I have for you is, and I don't know how many people this will apply to really, is when do you think that your model of understanding goes too far, right? So to paint a picture for people listening, because I'm sure your picture painting is already occurring here as a reaction to that question. I think oftentimes what happens with people who are really, really good at adherence, right? It's almost like, at least for me, and I'm sure you're the same way, it's actually more difficult at this point for me to skip a session than to do a session. So I'm like, I will craft the rest of my day around my session rather than, not necessarily adhering to it. And so oftentimes what happens, I feel like, is when you're a beginner, you learn about rules, right? You learn about these general principles. And following a program is helpful for so many reasons. The main one of which is just that you are doing the same thing consistently and that you are subscribing to a set of rules. But eventually you get to a point where that sort of rigid subscription to rules can actually start to work against you. And you can do things like sticking to a logbook when you're in pain, despite the pain. You can do things like maintaining the same technique on an exercise when maybe it's no longer feeling like it used to feel in terms of what it's stimulating, et cetera. So when do you think the model of sort of sticking to these principles and holding to them goes wrong? And specifically in application for you or client experiences, what do you kind of see in terms of like when that point happens and sort of how to address it when it does happen, if that makes sense?
So I found with teaching this stuff to clients and coaching them through various problems, I try to systematize again as much as possible. So I try and add these things to the system. So there is almost a FazLifts ecosphere where people think, okay, this problem equals this technique. Let's do this now. So as an example, tendonitis is a fairly common problem that people suffer with elbows, shoulders, knees, whatever it is. Everyone has something eventually. So I have a general, broad, almost a flow chart of what we should do to try and systematize it for as many people. And people like that, they find it quite useful and it works. It's a beginning point, it's a starting point, but it's okay. So my general thought process is if you are progressing, even minimally, and you're in no pain, fine. You're in the golden zone. Just don't even mess with it. Carry on. All good. Any questions about changing routine or a new technique, don't do it. Stick to what you're doing. Now, if you're not progressing and in no pain, then we might need more stimulus. So we might need to add more volume. And I like this way of explaining things because it helps to divorce people from this idea of if something isn't working for my pressing, then I change my entire routine. No, no. If something isn't working for your pressing, you change your pressing part of your routine. Everything else is fine. Um, and then the final sort of category is if you're progressing somewhat, but you're in a lot of pain, significant, maybe chronic pain, then potentially it's an overuse. You may be overloading that area. A very common one that I see all the time is when people are trying to do a lot of bench pressing or chest pressing and overhead pressing, as well as a lot of tricep work, elbows can get overloaded. They can get sort of tennis elbow. So I would just encourage them to either reduce the volume or switch around the exercises to produce less stress on that area. Because in my view, tendonitis generally is a recovery problem, even though that could translate from incorrect exercise selection or incorrect form. It's essentially still a recovery problem. So that's how I try to systematize things in the FazLifts ecosphere, so people view things as a very easy solution. Hopefully, that's the idea. So people don't think this is that complicated, and they think it's simple, and they feel like they have an answer if they have a problem.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I love that. So when you're assessing progress, let's remove the pain aspect of the conversation for a second, because that's mostly intuitive, I would say. When you're assessing progress and you're looking at, you know, timelines for progression, at what point do we say progress has stalled?
So I like to talk about rates of progression. I think the best thing to do is to look at your short-term rate of progression in the lens of your what you can achieve in the long term. So I think people are very concerned about what they can do next week or the week after, but I think if we just work backwards from a year. So I would say if you have a guy who's benching, say, two plates, okay, so reasonably strong, two plates for sets of eight, let's say, reasonably strong, well, pretty strong. I think a reasonable result for 12 months would be something like perhaps 10 kilos. That would be pretty solid. It's just a pretty damn good result. For sets of eight, he would be very strong. That would put him right in the advanced category. Now, if we take 10 kilos and we sort of divide that by, I don't know, let's say four. So let's say 4 blocks of 3 months across the year. Well, that's only 2.5 kilos or 5 pounds per 12 weeks, which is very achievable. And I would say for a guy who's that advanced, progressing at the rate of something like 2.5 kilos over the course of a block of 12-week block of training, I would say that's a great result. Because you stack that together over 4 times, you've got a fantastic year. So I try to help people, I try to get people to think about short-term progress, which is what they're mostly interested in, via the lens of long-term progression. What can you actually achieve? So if you don't manage to add 2.5 kilos to the bar this week, well, that's not a failure. It is perfectly fine within the context of what you're trying to achieve. And I think that helps to calm people down. And also it helps to satisfy the requirement of the quality of the reps, because I think that's very important. Because progressive overload, the second part of my little sentence is in standardized form. So we're not trying to break form. We're not trying to rest for longer and longer between repetitions and at rest at the top of a hack squat. We're not trying to change our form, change our range of motion. We are trying to be very, very consistent, very true to the quality of the workout and show that we are actually getting better via increased strength and increased muscle size. So that's my general system.
Awesome. So one of the things I want to backtrack that you said early on in this conversation was in relation to the sort of general principle of progressive overload and how you gave that example of, I don't know if it was a client or someone in your audience who said, hey, I changed this technique and then I had to lower the weight. Um, would you agree or disagree that there might be a proper place for that kind of change? And if so, aside from the pain side of things, when would you see that kind of change being appropriate?
Yeah, so this is another part of the FazLift system is the is honesty weeks. I think it's a good idea to do
Mm,
this every now and again. So this is a concept I was taught like decades ago now when I first started lifting because I was a young YOLO. I wanted to add weight to the bar and stuff.
yeah,
I
yeah.
was just lifting like, and I had the joint integrity to do it. I was lifting like crap. So I was taught this technique to say, well, every now and again, if your weights are getting ahead of you, bear in mind, then this was back in the old 5x5 days where everybody was asked to add 5 pounds to the bar every week, no matter what. And so you ended up taking longer and longer rests between sets. And even longer and longer rests between reps, just standing at the top of a 5 rep max squat, which you had to repeat, 5 times. So we were taught to do honesty weeks. So reset your form, standardize your rest periods, which I think is very important, which is ignored quite a lot in industry. Standardize your rest between reps as well. So intra set, I think, rest periods I've talked about on my channel before. Standardize your range of motion. Doesn't have to be excessive, just a reasonable range of motion. Standardize everything and start afresh. And then, yes, so there's definitely a room for pulling back. And I think that can be quite a good technique for people who are a bit aggressive with their weight progressions, which I was. But it goes back to the other principle of the rates of progression. It sort of equalizes everyone. The guys who are more aggressive, it pulls them back. The guys who aren't aggressive enough, it makes sure they're moving forward at least at a decent rate. So
Mm.
yeah, this is what I mean about trying to have systems in place where I can look at this principle and go, here you go, guys. This is what we'll do in this case.
Hmm. Yeah, makes sense. I something came to mind. A good friend of mine who is an IFBB pro, um, in the open division, so he's like
Mm.
one of the big guys. One of the
Yeah.
things that he likes to do a lot now, at least, that he did not used to do, and this is not something I think I would advise someone who like needed coaching themselves, uh, or who needed help from other people and insights into their programming, is let's say he was doing two sets of an exercise, he would really track one of the sets and he would track his first set. And he, like me, and he's influenced my training in many ways. We both like to just do everything to failure. Failure meaning full range into partials. I can't move at the end of my set. That's just what I prefer to do. Okay.
See, I like it.
And
Yeah.
anything else feels wrong and uncomfortable to me at this point.
Yeah,
Um, like I'm not trying at all. And
yeah.
so what he'll do is for the first set of the day, he will take a mindset of like, I'm gonna attack this shit. And I'm gonna like, I'm gonna take myself back to like my angsty high school days where I have my headphones in and I'm blasting Eminem or something like that. And I'm gonna get angry at all the people that I was angry at or something. And then the second set, it's like the headphones come off.
Mm.
There's more of this like meditative kind of approach, and everything is exactly kind of as you described. It's like you go from aggressive set to honest set. And the honest set is basically, it's taken with this approach of like, how can I make myself not as weak as possible, but like how can I make things as hard as possible on myself? How can I really keep myself in check? And so that is something that has been super influential to me because at times I had veered too far in one direction or another, where it's like both sets or all sets, three, four, whatever it is, are just like attack, attack, attack. And then I get done with my workout and I'm like, slammed. And I'm like, why am I slammed? And then alternatively, I've taken the approach where everything is kind of in that meditative, like, third person perspective. I'm looking down on myself. I'm just feeling the sensations. And that was like, I think that was also suboptimal because I think, in those instances, you are leaving some potential progress on the table. So I thought that was a really interesting connection to your idea. And I wonder if you've ever done something like that, or if you do that within the context of a single day or a single series of sets.
I think you need to have a bit of that to really achieve high levels of success.
Mm.
So I remember years ago I was working in with a certain British world record holder deadlifter who I won't name at this present time because it's a bit of an embarrassing story. And whenever he would go down to deadlift, he would be muttering something to himself, and the music was on, so I thought, what is he doing? What is he saying? And so I leaned in to try and hear what he was saying, and he was saying, "Don't let her be right about you." so,
Oh no,
so,
dude.
so you're talking real dark stuff, and then he
Yeah,
just
yeah.
ripped the bar, which was hilarious. So yeah, but I think
Man.
you need a bit of craziness. Like I definitely had a lot more when I was younger. There's some video clips of me, like repping 5 plates and doing various deadlifts in my home gym, which and I'm really going for it. The way that I accomplish that now is I will have different phases for my clients. This
I'm
is
sorry. I'm still just laughing. All
yeah.
right, all right. I'm gonna just cover my face. You continue. Sorry, continue the thread.
Don't let her be right about you.
Yeah.
Love it. Brilliant. Yeah, so I have different phases. So I like the moderate approach, but then I also don't mind moving from, say, low volume phases where you do go a bit crazier. You draw on the deep.
We're gonna have to edit this, bro.
Yeah.
No,
So
no,
funny.
I'm leaving it in.
My
I'm
God.
good. I'm good. I'm good.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Low volume
Brilliant.
phases.
And I knew exactly who he was talking about as well. So yeah,
Oh, yeah, even better. Okay,
even
sorry.
better. Yeah.
Rewind. We're resetting. Here we
Yeah.
go.
So yeah, we'll alternate phases. So for some guys who are in that sort of zone where they're intermediate, maybe heading towards advanced, I think it's a good thing to push some strength phases, particularly if you don't have a strength background. I think it's good. I think what I see in the industry quite a lot is
Hmm.
guys who are former powerlifters who come from a strength background really dog on strength and really lean into the pure hypertrophy Zen lifting kind of thing and promote that as a way for bodybuilding, not realizing that we are all a sum of our entire body of work. Just because for 5 years we did powerlifting and then now we're doing really Zen-like bodybuilding, doesn't mean that Zen bodybuilding is better. We actually are the result of all of those things together. So for a guy who I might coach, let's say he's just done some regular lifting for a number of years, I might have him alternate phases where he does 6 months of some higher intensity work, 6 months of some higher volume work, and just see what he responds to. And he generally responds quite well to the phasic approach of doing that. So that's how I get around to it. But I mean, it's one of those things where with natural trainers who I work with who are all genetically fairly average or below average, you've got to put out all the stops. And sometimes they need to force the gains. Sometimes they need to increase the strength, especially if they don't come from a strength background. But equally, other times I might get powerlifters who need to do a lot more of the Zen lifting and the bodybuilding stuff with the higher volumes and the shorter rest periods and the work capacity kind of stuff. So I think it's a case of ultimately and this points back to what we were originally talking about in terms of recommendations from different people. I think it points back to filling in the gaps of what you're actually missing from your training history. Just as a quick example, up until about 2007, all I did was low volume powerlifting work. That's all I did from the years of 99 to 2007. 2007, I was taught how to do a heavy, light, medium version of bodybuilding from a man called Dr. Casey Butt, who you probably are aware of. He did a lot of work on the genetic potential. He's kind of gone into obscurity now, but very well respected voice in the industry. He taught me how to use that, and that's now my wizard book. Now, I then did super high volume from 2007 to about 2010, which I think potentiated some of my best gains in powerlifting from 2010 to
Mhm.
2014. So I can't say any phase was better or worse. They were all part and parcel of my history. And I think what I see in the industry is people who are not self-aware enough to understand that what they're promoting now is the result of a combination of the training, not just the last 3 years. It's
Mhm.
actually 3 years which are potentiated by the prior 3 years. And on a micro level, with people who you and I talk to in our audiences, I would just encourage them to understand if they are benefiting a lot from, say, low volume right now, it may be because they did periods of high volume before, or vice versa. And some of these things help to potentiate each other.
Yeah, I think that's great. This is somewhat of a silly example, but you know how like people make movies and then they'll make movie sequels? So like for example, The Lord of the Rings, right? Which if anyone listening hasn't at least heard of The Lord of the Rings, I don't know what to say, but um people talk about how, is the Return of the King, is the last one the best? Is the first one the best? Is the middle?
Mm,
And to me, it's like it's just the wrong question. You know what I mean? It's like to take any of the movies in isolation, and stripped of the context of the entire story, it's a non-starter to me. The most recent example, I don't know if you've seen the movie Moana, okay? Love Moana. Moana's a great movie. Everyone check it out, listen to the soundtrack. Fantastic. People are like, is the second one better than the first? And I'm like, well, if what you mean is, did I enjoy the second one more? No, but I enjoyed the first one more. Okay. But if we're going to talk about the details of the story, we can't pretend as if these two movies are essentially a linear timeline. So I love that point. I think that's fantastic. And I think the point about strength as a background, sort of strength training approach as a background, I actually haven't really thought that much about this, but like, I never competed in powerlifting, but powerlifting was like my segue into taking lifting super seriously. And that was all I did maybe for the first like 4 years that I have been training. And so my time has basically now been split. So if I've been training close to 8 years now, which is a fraction of how long you have, it's basically been halvesies and halfsies, right?
mm,
And and I feel like there are many advantages that come with that. And I personally, obviously, this is a bias, but I personally would prefer that someone have that transition than the other way around. I feel like so many people now getting into bodybuilding for bodybuilding's sake is great, but I often see this kind of like just this general inability to push and to attack just attack, you know? And I think that that is a skill that cannot be purely conceptual. I think it's just, or really a concept that could be purely up here. It's something that, much like we were talking about earlier in terms of the application and just the only real learning and experience happening in application. I do feel like I'm super grateful for all of the times that I like pushed a little bit too hard and got hurt and had to learn from it. And like, on a Friday night at college, I'm like limping around, my campus because I've just like hit a deadlift PR and I don't even care because I've just hit the PR anyway. Those kinds of experiences were really formative for me. And I do feel like so many of those experiences are now being lost because of this sort of analytical approach, which obviously has so many other upsides.
Hmm.
Needless to say, I'm in agreement with that. Did you have any more to say on that, or because I have some other things written down here?
I think there is maybe a small exception with regards to bodybuilding because in the UK we have a strange microcosm where the UK bodybuilding scene is very low volume, high intensity focused, and as a result, you do have people who come up with a bodybuilding
Mm,
context, sorry, who push very hard, and that's all they've known because it's all about that Dorian Yates, Jordan Peters kind of work ethic.
mm,
So they will go on any given Monday night. You will see people going absolutely psycho on a hack squat or, nuts on a cable crossover. It's completely exaggerated a response to a cable curl, which I love to see. I'm all for that. It fires me up still to this day. But so I think UK is a law unto itself sometimes with some of that. I would even say that's true with the volume arguments too, because one of the reasons that I'm so critical of some of the volume research is because it does seemingly ignore an entire body/country of lifters who have done extremely well with 6 to 12 sets per
mhm.
body part per week, well over time, and that works. We have a lot of tremendous natural bodybuilders who don't do high volumes, who have got tremendous physiques right at the top of the natural leagues with that high intensity approach, which is a tradition here in England. I mean, it's what I grew up on.
Mhm. Yeah, cool. So that makes total sense. And I hadn't, you know, I tend not to think about cultural differences very much just because I'm not exposed to
Mm.
cultural differences. I kind of exist in this weird like United States silo of both content and people. So that's great. That's great for me to hear and to be made aware of. So I want to hop onto I mean, all this is related, but one of the things I find very interesting about you, Faz, and also that I admire about you, is you stick to a very narrow range of topics and are very comfortable saying that you don't want to reach outside of that sort of realm of topics. And I am the same way in my little realm where um, even within biomechanics, like there are certain concepts in biomechanics that get very, very complicated very, very fast that I'm unwilling to touch with a 10-foot pole. Um, just as one example that is relevant to this recent debate around lats, which I am sure if you've been privy to, you are sick of by now. Calculating forces across joints is like very complicated or appears to be very complicated. But that tangent aside, you mostly seem to stay away from the topic of biomechanics in general, while also being someone, I think, this is my speculation, but I think that you are also someone who I think probably understands biomechanics much better than most people who are talking about biomechanics. Um, Hot take, you don't have to respond to that, but it looks like you're going to say something.
I think there's a sense of responsibility when you're talking about things which are outside of your wheelhouse of teaching. So there's knowing and then there's teaching. And I take that distinction very seriously because I think people can know I can know stuff about how to lift and what positions feel good for me. But actually teaching that, I think I respect the fact that there's a responsibility with teaching because I was a school teacher. Like people ask me to speak about personal life and like love life and relationships and stuff, and mental health. And I really, I don't know, I find it difficult to speak about that kind of stuff. Unless I'm on somebody else's podcast, then I speak a bit more. But in my own channel, I think there's a degree of responsibility to speak out of things which you not only know, but you can communicate very well. I don't want to throw anyone off. So yeah, I think it's fair to say I stick to my own wheelhouse, and that will expand over time. Like I have done some reading on biomechanics, and I'm starting to become more comfortable in speaking about it. But it's a way in the future yet. So yeah, I think I just want to make the distinction between knowing and being able to teach. It's just a big one,
Hmm.
and I think that separates YouTubers as well. Some are clearly they have great physiques. They do a good job of displaying who they are, but the conversation around teaching their audience is maybe somewhat lacking. So maybe they do better at just demonstrating and hoping people pick things up. But yeah, no, I think you do that really well with the biomechanics. One thing I actually like about your content, Ben, is it is so relatable. I think I'll drop this comment on your conversation with Jonathan. I really appreciate the fact that you made the conversation very easy for me to understand, like what you were talking about, because I didn't really understand the whole ribcage stuff for a while. But when you broke it down in that conversation, as you do with a lot of things, it made it very easy for me to understand. It made me think, okay, that's okay, I get it. And that's a skill. There's a definite skill which I appreciate. But I get some of those comments myself on my channel, and it's always nice to hear.
Yeah.
That's the idea. Mm.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I love that distinction between knowing and teaching because um, it kind of what it tells me about you is that you have a certain level of respect for the craft almost, where um, many seem to not even be aware of the fact that it exists as a separate skill. It's just like, I think I know, therefore I say.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, now there are many people who don't know and also don't know how to teach, you know? I would much rather prefer someone who knows and doesn't know how to teach than neither, obviously. Um, but I guess you can't really know how to teach. But I don't know. In today's day and age, it does seem like teaching is becoming less and less and less. And I hadn't really thought about this before. It's being viewed as something that is not its own skill at all. It's just like I have an account and I can speak my mind because, America or whatever, you know. So I do love that approach. Just on the biomechanics topic before we move on, is there anything that in the context of like just you talking to me and vice versa that you not necessarily had a question about, but that you think would be an interesting thing to sort of talk about it from like a my lens sort of perspective? Was there anything just out of curiosity that you wanted to maybe touch on, whether it be anything in relation to like my conversation with Jonathan or anything else? And if not, we can just move on.
Yeah, no, I liked what you had to say about with Jonathan about that conversation. I also really liked how you broke down the Keenan Flaps thing, because just inherently that didn't sit right with me when I saw it. Um, so I like the fact that you broke it down in that way, and it made a lot more sense when you explained the role of the scapula, and that seemed to connect a lot of the dots for me. So no, at the moment, I'm happy with some of the controversies because I tend to look at your work. I do still look at Jonathan's stuff. I do look at Joe Bennett, who I really admire. I think he's very good, um, and a few other guys in the industry. So, as you pointed out, this is stuff I'll look at, but I won't necessarily talk about it yet. But I have a side interest in. Maybe at some point I'll talk about it more. But no, I think those conversations have been really useful. Mm.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to your venture into the biomechanics the realm here, my friend.
Can
Uh,
butcher it.
yeah. Well, no, I don't think so. But one of the people also that I have spoken with many times that I communicate with on a regular basis is Cass Hansen, who many people listening to this will know quite well. He is someone who, in my estimation, has gotten much better over the last several years, especially in the communication aspect of things, and in just his like approach to talking to more people and communicating with people online in a way that is more digestible at this sort of interpersonal level. And I would recommend anyone who is listening to this who is interested in that topic go listen to him. But he is also kind of like his level of knowledge and understanding is he understands the biomechanics topics in a way that I think no one really else that I know personally does. And he spends the time to be able to steelman his own opinion, strawman his own opinion, steelman the other side. Just he is just someone who I really admire in that sense. So I think one of the things, maybe just to tie this thread into the original conversation that we were having about like trustworthiness and who to listen to and what to look for, people that I think just forgetting about the information, people who seem to display like a level of self-awareness and integrity. I think integrity is being lost on people just in terms of not just in terms of like what content creators are generally displaying, but then also in terms of like what people are looking for in creators. Like rather than looking for a physique or information, I think it's super valuable, and I see this in you to look for people um, who are not only willing to do things like admit they were wrong or admit they've changed their mind, but also people who clearly seem to be acting like people and not like caricatures of a brand, and people who seem to be super concerned with like genuinely helping people, and that kind of thing is I think very difficult to describe in words, but just when you observe people for long enough you get the sense that like, oh, this is really just a person who just loves this stuff and like is obsessed with this stuff. And so I definitely see that
But
in you.
on that note, I did think of something that I wanted to ask you about. It jogged my memory because of the type of person you were talking about. Jogged my memory because he's talked about this in the past. Um, Years ago, there was some conversations between a couple of fairly prominent members of the industry. One of them was Cass, and one of them was a fairly outspoken person. And they were talking about the lats losing leverage above sort of 90 degrees. Do you remember that conversation?
Yeah.
Could you just Eli 5 that for me? I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. You just Eli 5 that for me. What's going on there?
Can you explain what that term you just used is?
Explain it to me like I'm five.
Ah, okay. So
Eli 5.
you just abbreviated it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we
It's
have
because
that.
it's a subreddit. That's why Eli 5.
Okay. And I didn't know. Now I know. So I have two things on my bingo card now. I have cuppa, which by the way, for those of you who don't know, Faz is drinking a cuppa and I'm drinking a coffee. And then also EI5. Cool. So yeah, the basic concept is basically like the lats attached to the upper arm, right? And I have my Skeletor, my skeleton friend back here. Um, so whether you're talking about the upper lats, the lower lats, they all just insert on. Oh, here we go. How convenient. They'll just insert on this bone,
Okay.
which you know as the humerus, which many know as the upper arm. And because they attach to the upper arm, roughly speaking, right here somewhere, they not only move this thing around in this socket, but by pulling on this thing, they also pull on the scapula, right? Because these two things, they're connected by very strong ligaments like this. So the people who think that they can separate motion of these things, big mistake. We've run into problems that way.
Mm.
So when we're talking about like the degree of, elevation of the upper arm, whether it's you're raising forward or you're raising out to the side, much of the time when people are talking about leverage of this muscle, i.e., do the lats lose leverage above 90 or do they lose leverage above 120, et cetera? What they're talking about is really how well do the lats move this joint, right? The glenohumeral joint, the shoulder joint itself. And that is an important part of the equation for the lats, but it is actually a smaller part of the equation than how much the lats act on the scapula. There are a number of people who I don't think should be speaking on this topic who are speaking on this topic and, in my opinion, butchering it, who basically say, or really their side of the argument is the lats can't move the scapula and or the collarbone. They can only move this joint, right? But as a simple sort of description, if the lats pull on the upper arm and the upper arm attaches directly and mostly in a sort of rigid sense to the shoulder blade and the collarbone, the lats therefore move the whole, all those three bones, collarbone, shoulder blade, and upper arm together. So when we're talking about leverage, we need to consider the fact that the lats have leverage not just at this joint, but also at this joint over here. Again, I wish I had a collarbone. It's over there. But for those people who are watching, the collarbone basically sits at an angle kind of like that. And so these two things, they elevate and move forward and backward and do all those things together. So when we're talking about leverage, we can't just talk about it from the perspective of that one upper arm bone joint. We have to talk about it holistically. And so when we're talking about pull downs, where your arms are all the way above overhead, right, the additional length change that you see in that kind of motion is substantial relative to if you only say went to 90 or 120 or anything like that. And so for the people who say, oh, the lats lose leverage above this point, what they're missing is the lats roll on this bone and the collarbone. And the reason that that is important and consequential is because much of the length change comes directly from that sort of shrugging motion, unshrugging motion. A simple way to sort of visualize this is if you think about like, okay, if my index finger is where the lats attach, think about how much, and you imagine the lats attachment just going down, doesn't matter where, but just imagine it going down. Look at how much my index finger moves if I go like this, right?
Mm.
It moves like a fair amount, but like if I just move outward like this, let's say. So if you watch my index finger, it's like, I don't know how you would measure that. If you pictured, let's say this and this 90 degrees of motion, it's maybe like a couple inches, maybe an inch or two or something like that. But now look how much more directly this whole thing moves if my whole shoulder girdle together moves upward. So when you combine this and this, you get the most length change. When you just limit it to this, you get very little, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that. So, for me, that kind of points back to something relating to what you posted today. Actually, you did a video on rearward shrugs, and the guy who popularized those back in the 80s, I think it was a man called Paul Kelso. He had a book on shrugs, and he popularized all kinds of shrugs. I mean, the one that really took off was the horizontal rearward shrug, but he had one which was actually a pull down shrug. And so the entire idea was to train your lats from that position. So that was a pretty good exercise. I mean, it didn't take off as well as the rearward shrug, but it certainly did. I know from my days being a powerlifter, one of the best ways to lock in your deadlift off the floor is to flex your lats because that will contract your scapula and keep you stable, keep the upper back from rounding over. So yeah, your way of explaining things made a lot of sense. No, yeah, definitely.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and I love that. I love that you know that. I didn't know that about the guy Kelso himself in terms of I just thought there was that one motion that was named after him or that he named. Um, and
He
I
had an
also,
entire he had a funny story. He had an entire book, and he was inspired. There was a shrug which was inspired by Dr. Casey Butt, and he was going to name the exercise after him, but he didn't for obvious reasons.
yeah, yeah, the butt
So
shrug.
he's written that in the book. It was going to be the butt shrug, but
Dude, we should just start calling it that, whatever it happens to be. I prefer that. Um, yeah, and also for listeners too, I the way that I will teach this to students in my mentorship is there's a kind of like spectrum of much in the same way there's a spectrum of like recruitment when you're doing like a pull down to something that's slightly more horizontal to something that's horizontal to something that's low to high. There is like a spectrum of shrugging, moving, this stuff. So if your arm is up here and you're sort of doing like a reverse shrug as you described, it's like that's the most like lat specific thing. And then the more that you move down to this angle and go back and forth, okay, we still got some lats there, but we also started to shift up or back. And then the more that I start to change that angle upward to the point where I'm now just doing a normal shrug, the recruitment shifts. So as the angle basically moves lower, the recruitment on the back goes higher, right? So like the highest thing to the lowest thing is the lowest thing on the back, the lower lats, and then you basically just traverse upward from there. It's a pretty simple way to think about it. Um,
That's perfect, and it also matches the reality of what we know from bodybuilding law. That's perfect. I love that.
yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I mean that for me, that's my acid test. Which is a bit simplistic, but if it matches what I know from bodybuilding experience, or rather what I know from my years of experience in the gym, then it's usually good. It's one of the things I like about your content. For a lot of what you say, you provide a very complicated, an in-depth explanation, which is needed for things which really just click. in terms of which match my reality. I always get very suspicious of people who provide explanations for things which don't actually reflect the reality of what I know to be true.
Mm.
Yeah, like the deadlift building the back, I mean, you won't believe it, but for years people said the deadlift just doesn't build the back. And I remember going onto the internet in 2021 for the first time on YouTube and people asking me how I built my back because it's one of my more dominant body parts. And I said, lots of deadlifts, blah blah. And one of the first things I was told was a deadlift doesn't build a back. So
Mhm.
on the one hand, I'm out how to build my back, and second hand, when I give an answer, they tell me I'm wrong. So
Yeah, I don't think a
seems
deadlift would I don't think a deadlift would go too well if you didn't have traps or lats. So
right. Yeah.
yeah, which is different, of course, just for people listening, which is different, of course, from us saying you should do deadlifts to grow your lats, right, as the primary thing. That's
Right.
not what we're
Yeah.
saying.
Hmm.
But just to make that distinction
Still
clear.
have a balanced routine, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. The last thing I wanted to say on that topic, just because it came up, is for anyone who has heard the sort of lat argument going around of like the lats don't depress the shoulder or the lats only act on that one bone that is pivoting, that claim would be like saying that the abs, the rectus abdominis, let's say, do not perform a crunch, right? Because none of your rectus abdominis attaches directly to the joints that are moving, right? So like for those people who don't know your rectus, oh, I can point to it. Ready? It attaches from there and it goes up, 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 and it attaches, boom, right there on the ribs.
Mm.
So neither of these two sites, one or two, that's really hard to do, attach directly to these joints right there, these facet joints and the vertebral bodies and the space between the bodies. Um, there's no ab that directly attaches to those on the front side. So like your internal obliques, they have like this posterior division that wraps like pretty far around and actually loops back there. But in terms of crunching, that's a similar claim. And I have not had a reasonable response to that counterpoint. So just for people listening, the takeaway there is a muscle does not literally need to attach to a bone to move it,
Mm.
to move joints directly is what I mean, right? So your abs obviously attach to your ribs and your pelvis, but they don't attach to your spine directly, at least the ones that I'm referring to.
I hadn't heard the claim of the abs, that one. I haven't heard that argument. So people can write in the comments name and shame, just
Yeah,
so I'm aware.
yeah, there are other. Well, the thing is like no one sensibly would deny that. Like, if
Yeah.
I said, "Hey, do your abs perform a crunch?" People are like, "Yeah." I'd be like, "Oh, okay. Well, they don't attach directly to your six pack doesn't attach directly to your spine. So how are you supporting this other claim that the lats don't
Yes.
move the clavicle or something?" And another good example is like your erectors. Like your erectors, do they attach to the front of your ribs? No. But when you arch your back, the front of your ribs move in the same way that, your biceps, they don't attach to your ulna, they attach to your radius, but they move your ulna, when they bend the elbow. So many, many, many examples, but I think any experienced lifter is probably just not taking any of that seriously
I
to
mean,
begin with. So
I think if you ask any powerlifter who's been injured before, they'll tell you that there's a complicated mesh of muscles which are responsible for moving your joints. I mean, friends of mine who have been powerlifting for years, some of them have torn their knees, like the patella tendon and the actual part of the knee, and various injuries which are really nasty. But it's always amazing how the body just forms other routes towards mobility. Like as
mm,
long as your leg is still attached, there's going to be some way that your body will just figure it out. One of my friends is a very good powerlifter. He's one of the best UK powerlifters, and he tore his knee pretty badly about a month before a very large championship show. Didn't tell anyone on social media and just went in and did the competition. Sort of just adjusted. It was incredible.
yeah.
He did use knee wraps, of course, but it was just phenomenal. Like it's phenomenal what the body's. I think I saw a study once years ago where they looked at collegiate level footballers in America and they did some scans on just internal injuries. And these were people who self-reported that they were healthy and they were fit. And most of the scans showed some kind of dysfunction, like the rotator cuff's torn or some kind of lower back dysfunction, but the body just adjusts and adapts around it due to this fairly complicated mesh of muscle which just covers everything. So yeah, I like that point.
Yeah, same here. So I want to finish up with you. my friend, talking about just content a little bit more broadly for you because you've had a very sort of interesting path up to this point in terms of just like it is unusual for someone to have been lifting for this long and this experience for this long to have only just sort of popped up on the scene, if you will. So I'm interested kind of in two things, two separate threads. One of which is like, why did you start making content in the first place? Like, what did you see? What did you feel? And then also, what is the kind of current process that you go through, if any, when you're deciding what content to make and how to make it? So first thing is the sort of intro. Second thing is more specific in terms of how do you go about deciding what to make and how to make it?
Well, I won't bore people with my teaching background, but essentially, I was growing out of love with teaching and the education system in the UK for a number of years for various reasons, which I won't go into now because they're all quite boring. But around about 2015, I was asked to coach somebody. I live in a fairly small city, and if you compete, if you're fairly good, people know who you are. So the word got around that I kind of knew what I was doing. This was when I was in my mid 30s. So I got my first coaching client, and then I got a few others, powerlifting clients and whatnot. And so eventually eventually that sort of picked up. And around about 2018, I decided to do something online to push the business further. At the time, I was still coaching part-time. I wasn't really full-time until 2020. And I started a podcast because I think it's important to try and find your niche. So I thought it was a wrong idea, but this is going to sound really silly and self-deprecating, but feel embarrassed saying it now, but I honestly thought nobody would want to see a 40-year-old man talking about bodybuilding.
Mm,
So I did a podcast because that would be just my voice. And I thought, well, I'll just speak. And it was moderately successful, but not really. You can still find it on Spotify and SoundCloud if you look. So that was all right. But then I decided to go onto Instagram. That was okay as well. And then in 2021 was when I decided to try YouTube. And it turned out people do actually want to see a 40-year-old man talk about bodybuilding. And I think the combination of my experience, both of lifting, of competition, of coaching, because at that time I had been coaching for 6 years, as well as my 15-year teaching background, really seemed to resonate with a lot of people. And I just, as a point of just being humble, I really am flabbergasted at the response I've had. I mean, yeah, it just yourself, huge Instagram following. I had a message from Omar Isuf last year just saying, "Hey, I like your content," and I was like,
mm,
because I honestly do think, Ben, I just think I'm a 15K account. Who am I? There's lots of guys who are doing what I do. I've got a phone appointment with a guy who's on YouTube with 1 million subs next week because he wants to help me with my content for free.
yeah.
It's just insane. So clearly, I find it baffling because I'm just me. But clearly, people seem to see something in my work, and as long as I stay honest to what my mission is, then I think that's a good thing. So to go to your second point of your question, in terms of where I get my ideas from, it's all from my coaching. So I have a stable of one-to-one clients. I also have a coaching group, and I also have a range of people who I sort of like long distance coach via consultations. So every 6 months, they might consult with me, and I move them along. So I have about 5 or 6 guys who do that as well. So every day, I'm dealing with problems. I'm problem solving. I'm talking to clients. I'm adjusting things, and I'm living it. So content for me is super easy because it's literally just the conversations I have every day. I mean, just today I had 3 content ideas. They don't all make it to videos because they have to have a degree of breadth to ensure they hit all the right notes. But there's so many, there's limitless ideas, and I think I would love to carry on coaching for as long as I can because if I don't, then I think my content would suffer because I would just be picking out topics which are perhaps relevant or reaction topics which might not help people as much as I'd like to think my content does. So if a client of mine has an issue and I speak to them about it, I can make a video about that because it's relevant, because it's literally my audience. My clients are my audience. So that's where I get my ideas from.
Well, I think that those two dots connect very well because I think what people are seeing in your content is what is underneath of that, is that it's a reality. It's not something that is manufactured or fabricated for the sake of something else. It's just, it is what it is for itself. And I think that people are drawn to that. And I think that's what people are resonating with. That's certainly the way that I felt too. And I couldn't agree more with you on the point of where content comes from, because so like some people who I speak to, who I am helping learn about the biomechanics stuff, they also have an interest in becoming content creators, and oftentimes that is the first question that they ask is like, how do you come up with ideas? And in the kindest, least facetious way, I try to basically say like, if you're actually interested in the topics and you're constantly trying to learn and you're constantly applying the topics, there's that question should just never be asked, because even in, a system like yours, let's say, which is, as it sounds like, as standardized as anything could possibly be, there are always things that here and there are going to come up with this person, that person, and that's the beauty of channeling your real experience into content. And I think that, I don't know how you feel about this, but just globally, it seems like creators in general are becoming more themselves and less of this kind of manufactured thing, with the exception, say, of like, like a Mr. Beast is like the best and worst example of this to me, where, if you watch his early video, not that I'm some like Mr. Beast fanboy, it's hard not to know about him when you're
Yeah, of
on
course.
YouTube at all. Um, but, you know, in the early days of his content, for those who don't know, he would literally make video. I think he made one video that was like counting to 10,000 or something with no breaks. And he literally just sat in front of his computer and was like one, two, three, all the way up. And maybe it was even more than that. And that's crazy. And that's crazy to me. I don't like, but like, dude, he was him.
Yeah.
And now it's like rebuilding, the Willy Wonka chocolate factory. And, these people they're going to win $500,000 at the end of this. And so the more that his content has trended in that direction, the less interested I've become. And
Yeah.
I think globally, the more interested people have become in stuff that is less sort of in your face, manufactured, meant to sort of garner attention. And also, I'm sure you've seen, well, I don't know if you've seen this, because it doesn't seem like you ever went through a phase of like fakeness in content, but I have certainly been pulled in directions previously that I've been not so happy about in retrospect. And from a business perspective, like ultimately what I care about is um, like how many people can I help, and then most specifically, how many people who are going to be my customers can I help? And because ultimately, like I'm not on social media to like become known for social media. I'm on social media to share information and to make a bit and to create a business. And so the more like real, you know, s- genuinely inspired content that I make, the better the business has done. And the more that I move away from that and toward things like views, it is all so clear to me in retrospect. But when you're in the thick of it, if there's any advice that I can give to people who are maybe interested in this, is make it real. Like it has to be real, because business is, and at least in my experience, it needs to be real, and people are attracted to real, and they pay for real. They do not pay for things that are flashy or that evoke sort of these negative responses. So just to finish up, do you have any sort of words of wisdom, advice for people maybe who want to start making content? Anything that comes to mind?
I think everything you've said there is really relevant. I have a general rule for myself. I try not to consume other people's content too much,
Mm,
which is a bit of a shame because I do have a number of guys in the industry who I really admire. But if they produce the type of content that I also produce, I try not to watch them actively, which is, I mean, I'll still leave a comment of support every now and again because they're my um, colleagues, I guess, or friends slash colleagues. Guys like Jeffrey Verity Schofield, me and him get along really well, and a few others. So, but I try not to consume other people's content because I think it can lead to a situation where you are subtly influenced by their ideas, and that's not great. Um, oh, Ben, I think you've paused on my screen.
you
You still
sure?
there? Oh no, yeah, okay, yeah. So just carry on. Yeah. So yeah, I think we can all like to think we're strong-minded and we have our own, influences and whatever. But I think I'm only human, and so I try to circumvent that by just not consuming very much of similar content to my own. So a lot of times people ask me, what do I think of so and so's opinion of this, and I don't always know. Like I had the questions about Jonathan Warren's ribcage stuff for a long time, and I'm just like, he seems like a nice guy. I'll look into it, but I genuinely didn't have an opinion on it for a long time because I try not to. Um, so yeah, so yeah, if I was to offer somebody a word of support, in addition to what you've said already, I think just try to create your own philosophy of coaching and of training and build on that. Spend your energy building on that. Um, a very easy example that I can give you is about 3 or 4 years ago, trained by JP, Jordan Peters, started to use a band attached behind him when he's doing RDLs. Every single bodybuilding coach in the UK did that. And it was both embarrassing and hilarious. Embarrassing because I live in this country, and hilarious because they're all idiots. So, and it's fine for JP because he invented it. Like that's his thing. So I have no disrespect to him at all. I think he's fantastic. But the point is more that they were so keen to copy because it just displayed their complete lack of coaching philosophy themselves, and that I think is a real red flag to me. So just try and produce your own content, I think is it. I don't think I sound like anybody else. Some people have said I sound a bit like Lyle McDonald, but I think that's because we came from the same sources of information. He really likes a lot of studies that I really like the one from the meta-analysis from 2010. Forget the name now, but is a famous one anyway. But we have a lot of similar source of information. I mean, not saying I haven't learned from him, but I try not to consume as much just because I can keep it organic and I can just work on my clients and find and spot trends with them. So yeah, if you are going to be a content creator, create your own system and have your own coaching philosophy and work with some integrity. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's a great place to pause here. For anyone who's still listening, Faz, and they're interested in coaching from you, I'm just going to link your channel or your website. So we don't need to worry about that if anyone wants to inquire after hearing this man speak, which if any of you are interested, I would highly recommend it. And if any of you have questions or comments for maybe future talks that we will do and things that people want to see us tackle, please let us know below. And yeah, Vaz, thanks for having the chat, man. I would love to do this again sometime.
Ben, thank you very much for the talk. I really like the invite. I really appreciate the invite. And yes, we will, as we discussed off air, we will be starting our separate streaming channel where Ben and I will be streaming World of Warcraft PvP for 12 hours at a time. So if you're interested in that, I believe it's going to be called Ben and Faz do PvP, something like that. So
Okay. Yeah, we'll
look out for
workshop
that.
that. Yeah, we'll
Yes, I'll
workshop
link
that.
that in the description. So,
Actually, though, if anyone still watching plays World of Warcraft, drop a comment below. Tell me your race, your class, and your spec, okay? And then what you're interested in.
for me, tell me your current season's mythic rating. Just
Okay.
FYI, not that I'm bragging or anything, because obviously I'm a grown man, but 3,400. Just saying, this season.
Yeah, not that you're bragging or anything.
I mean, it's no big deal. It's fine.
Yeah.
Don't worry
Yeah.
about it. Don't even congratulate me. It's not a problem.
All right.
I don't want to hear your adulation.
All right. I won't. I won't. You have that promise. All right, everyone.